Hey, Econ Kids. We are now going to look at Module 17 in Section 4 here. It's about aggregate demand, the introduction, and determinants. So when you think about aggregate demand, it looks like a demand curve, right? So as we're dealing with aggregate demand here, the only difference is this is the demand for everything. So we have a couple different labels. If you label this just price over here, like a P or a Q for micro, that's going to be marked incorrect. So you have to make sure that this is price level on your y-axis, and down here we have to say real GDP. Okay, and then we'll have our aggregate demand curve that slopes down. All right, so a couple different labels there just to make sure that you're like, yes, I definitely know what I'm talking about from a macro point of view. And what we're showing is how the price level is going to be determined by how many people want all sorts of goods, right? So this isn't the law of demand. So the law of demand shows you what happens with an individual in a price change. Instead, this is aggregate demand, right? And it's showing you what happens when for the price of basically everything when there's demand for everything. So it's kind of showing you, that bigger picture, more of a result than a cause necessarily in terms of like the law of demand, maybe in a micro sense. So why is it downward sloping? Well, first of all, we have what's called the wealth effect. And the wealth effect basically says when that price level falls, you have more purchasing power, right? Feels like you have more money. So more purchasing power increases consumer spending. So therefore, price levels down, you're going to spend more. Then we have this downward sloping line. We also have something called the interest rate effect. And the interest rate effect states that when interest rates are lower, right, so a decline in interest rates, you're going to have more spending. Why? Well, because money is cheaper to borrow. So if it's cheaper to borrow, you're going to borrow more of it, and then you'll spend more. So there's my aggregate demand curve. There's my price. There's my price going down, and you'll see an increase in real GDP. If you see like the opposite happen, right, the prices go up, real GDP is going to decrease. Can the whole thing shift? Sure. Right? So just like we can move up and down, just like we did with a demand curve in micro, you can also shift this whole thing out to AD2 out here, or we can shift the whole thing back, right? One reason it might shift out is due to expectations. If consumers are positive about the future, they might say, hey, I'm going to go spend more, right? I'm going to go buy more at every single price. So you're going to have more aggregate demand, even though like price levels maybe stay the same, whatever that might be. The other one could be overall wealth. When the value of household assets go up, people are going to say, you know what, I have more money. Maybe my house is worth more. Maybe I have the opportunity to borrow against my house. So I'm going to go out and spend more, right? So aggregate demand will increase. And the last thing is existing stock of capital. Well, at least the last thing on this slide. If firms have lots of capital already, then investment tends to slow down. If they feel like, hey, I'm pretty good right here, like we have enough in storage and we have enough facilities here to maintain, then maybe I'm not going to invest, because our aggregate demand really is just, it's GDP, right? So it's consumption, it's investment, it's government spending. So if any of those things takes a hit, then aggregate demand is going to take a hit. So when you think about existing stock of capital from a firm perspective, if I got plenty of capital on hand, then I might just say, I'm not going to invest right now, and investing will slow down, and investment is part of GDP. Shifts of the aggregate demand curve. Now here's a couple that are like new to us. Like some of those other things kind of make sense from maybe even taking micro first, but now we can also shift that aggregate demand, not from a consumption standpoint, not from an investment standpoint, but what about that G, right? What about the government? So there's two different things going on. One is fiscal policy, and fiscal policy is the government's ability to spend money or to tax their constituents. So when you think about spending more money, if the government decides, hey, we're going to take some of our budget and we're going to go buy something, if they're buying a truck at Oshkosh Truck, if they're buying another ship out at Marinette Marine, they're going to definitely move this aggregate demand curve. more government spending. If they tax you less, that will also shift the aggregate demand because you are being taxed less. It feels like you have more money in your pocket. You have more money in your pocket, you're going to spend more money. So spending themselves or taxing you less, both are going to make aggregate demand shift to the right. Now, could it happen where aggregate demand shifts to the left? Sure, just do the opposite, right? If you decide to, like, if your economy seems like, ooh, maybe we have a little inflation going on, or, there's too much stuff, we're a little too hot right now as an economy, maybe we want to just slow it down a little bit, make sure we don't have to worry about any sort of inflation. You could spend less from a government point of view, or you could raise taxes. That also would get this aggregate demand to go to the left. Okay, so that's fiscal policy, the government's ability to tax and spend. The other one is monetary policy. Monetary policy is the Federal Reserve's job, okay? And so not Congress and not taxing and spending, but it's the Fed, and the Fed is gonna say, you know what? If we put more money into the system, right, whether it's buying up bonds or something like that, if we put more money into the system, then this is gonna shift to the right. Because it's going to have, like, the economy has more cash, right? They have more money, more ability to go get that money for you in terms of, like, maybe a cheaper loan. If you look at the bottom one, same thing, lower interest rates, right? They could do that too. By lowering the interest rates, what's going to happen? Your ability to go borrow money is greater. So now you're going to go spend money. So either they put more money into the system, which then in turn causes the banks to just loan more out, or they just choose to, like, lower an interest rate themselves, which is kind of what putting more money in is going to do anyway. You're going to push this out to the right. Could we use the Federal Reserve to push this back to the left if the economy was too good? Sure, just do the opposite. Put less money into the system or raise the interest rates. Both those things will yank aggregate demand back a little bit. And sometimes, in times of a recession, we want to push this thing out if we can. In times of inflation, we want to pull this thing back. So when you look at fiscal versus monetary policy and whose job is it, okay? First of all, who conducts it? In terms of fiscal policy, that's going to be Congress, right? The federal government. Congress has to, go through the process of either doing something with taxes or doing something with spending. Who conducts monetary policy? That is the Federal Reserve. And we'll learn more about this and their jobs a little later on in the semester. But as you look at it, what are the tools? Well, the federal government through fiscal policy can tax and spend, or again, government transfers, right? Basically taking money from one and putting it someplace else through something like Social Security, for example. The Federal Reserve, what do? They can manipulate interest rates. They can manipulate the money supply. If we want to increase aggregate demand, we're using expansionary fiscal policy. If we want to decrease aggregate demand, it's contractionary fiscal policy. Okay, so we're either spending more or spending less, or taxing more or taxing less. Federal Reserve, loose money policy or a tight money policy. Either we want to make it easier for people to get money so that this thing kicks out to the right, or we're going to make it more difficult and this thing pulls back to the left. That is aggregate demand and how we can manipulate it. We'll do aggregate supply next. See you next time.